The Trump administration is currently overseeing an unprecedented growth in a system of camp detention for migrants seeking asylum, extraordinary in both its size and its scope, with more than 19,000 immigrants currently in custody. Many of those people are being held in, frankly, shocking conditions, as pointed out over and over by the detainees themselves, their families, lawyers, and even the government itself. One report from a Homeland Security watchdog this week, internal IG report, called the conditions at two centers, quote, egregious. It's gotten so bad that some migrant children are sleeping on concrete benches or outside of Border Patrol stations because of overcrowding. The administration is even canceling English classes, recreational programs, and legal aid for unaccompanied migrant children in federal shelters. The Trump administration says the surge in migrants has tied their hands. And there has, let's be clear, there has been a surge in apprehensions at the border, with more than 144,000 people detained or found inadmissible at the southwest border just last month. But there are two issues to consider here. First, migration in the U.S., unauthorized migration and apprehensions began shooting up in January as the president began his bloody political fight over the wall. And it is unclear if there's a connection between him starting that fight and a bunch of people thinking the door was closing and coming towards the border. And secondly, there is no need, to be clear, to detain many of these people in the first place, as the overwhelming vast majority, including, obviously, children, pose absolutely zero public safety risk. So what happens when a country decides to put tens of thousands of people into camps? What can history tell us? Here with me now, author Andrea Pitzer, who literally wrote the book on the subject. It's called One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. It came into my consciousness just a few days ago, and I have gotten it and started reading it. It's excellent. Andrea, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on, Chris.
So I guess let's start with this. I mean, if people think of camps, right, they think of the iconic example being the Nazis and concentration camps. One of the things your book spells out is different governments, even democratic ones, have used camps as tools of detention in various contexts throughout history. Tell me about that.
So when people think of concentration camps, they tend to think of Auschwitz and the death camps, because looking back from today, it looms so much larger than everything else that's happened in history, as it should. We should remember it first. But I really wanted to look into how we got to that point. So I started with when that phrase emerged, which was in Cuba in the 1890s. And from there, I looked at how this idea of rounding up a whole bunch of civilians, non-combatants, and putting them in detention without trial, how did that get to be seen as a good idea? And it turns out it's been tried all over the world again and again.
Has it been tried with immigrant populations particularly, that, like the populations we're seeing now, people who don't have any, there's no reason to suspect they're dangerous in any way, they just are people seeking asylum and are unauthorized in the eyes of this administration?
Yes, there are a few different examples. Probably the closest one I can think of in the moment is that during the Spanish Civil War, hundreds of thousands of refugees from that conflict fled Franco when they started losing, and they headed north into France. Hundreds of thousands of people across a really small border. And the French were suddenly dealing with this huge influx of people, and it was politically unstable at that time, so they decided they would put them all in these very distant locations without much access to anything and with no food. And of course, people got very, very sick and started to die. And so this idea of that refugees didn't deserve very much, but maybe they deserved something, sort of has the same roots there. I think it's worth noting that those camps later were used by the French to put a lot of Jews that fled Nazi Germany. They put them in the same camps later. And then when France fell, the Nazis deported the Jews that were still in them and sent them to Auschwitz. So one of the things I'd like to say is camps don't always end up where they start either.
What do you mean by that?
That very, very frequently. Another example we could say would be Guantanamo. In the 1990s, sure. Guantanamo was used as a migrant detention camp for refugees, for tens of thousands of refugees fleeing Haiti and Cuba, and really serious political instability there. And they were held long without knowing what was going to be happening to them. There were riots. HIV-positive patients were segregated without medical help or legal help, and eventually the courts had to intervene. And that whole story is really how we ended up with post-9/11 detention at Guantanamo and all that became, which was quite a different thing than it had started out in the 90s.
What are you, informed by your research, what are your concerns about the system that is being put in place right now?
Well, I have several concerns. One is that my research showed pretty conclusively that these camps don't close themselves. that outside the end of a war that marks the end of needing to detain what you see as a foreign or hostile population, outside of being overthrown or serious political outside force being used, they don't just end because they're useful. They serve as a target of undesirable people. You can point to these people are the problem and see we're doing something about it. And so, A, we shouldn't expect them to close anytime soon. I would say they'll also get bigger, and conditions in them are going to get worse. All the reports we're getting are that conditions are already worsening, and the numbers are now driving, as you noted already, this calendar year, particularly in May, have been going higher and higher and higher. They don't seem to have a plan on how to deal with this other than to punish the refugees, the asylum seekers, or to demand that Mexico take care of it. I don't think either one of these is a realistic solution. I expect to see contagious diseases, malnutrition in some cases, and mental health crises. I mean, we're going to have that all very soon. There might be reports already coming of that.
Andrea Pitzer, thank you so much for sharing those essential insights with us. I really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.